Hello, everyone, and welcome to the US Studies Online's June Book Hour. Please note that the book hour is recorded and made available on our YouTube channel. Therefore, if you wish, you're welcome to keep your cameras on or off. Today, we will be discussing Fran Ross's seminal rediscovered novel, Oreo, which originally came out in 1974. But first, if I could ask our wonderful undergraduate readers to introduce themselves. Tony.
Hi, yeah, I'm Tony Hawkins. I'm an undergraduate, contemporary military history and international history at the University of Salford in Manchester. Probably the oldest of the group here, without a doubt. Went back to education 2 years ago, now 50, and loving it. It's great. Thank you.
Ben.
Hello, yeah, I'm Ben Sidaway. I'm an undergraduate student at the University of Worcester studying history. My main sort of interests are American history, specifically sort of 20th century American history, but obviously other broader stuff as well, as and when. And then in September, I'm moving to the University of York to do my master's there. So that's a bit about me.
Yeah.
My name is Mia Prince Kelly. I'm a third year student at the University of Edinburgh studying English literature, and my main interests are probably realism and absurdism, contradictory, but yeah, both of those.
And Luke.
Hiya, my name's Luke Lawrence. I am an American. I study at the University of St. Andrews studying English and Theology, and my main interests are the intersection of American literature, especially 20th century American literature, and theology, philosophy, and all the history around that.
Brilliant. Thank you, everyone, and welcome. So a bit of a context for the novel and author before I turn over to our readers who will lead the discussion today. Fran Ross was born in 1935, and she passed at age 50 in 1985 from cancer. Oreo was her only novel, but she worked also as a proofreader, copywriter, and TV writer in New York. Oreo arrived in 1974 at the height of not only the Black Power movement, but also the Black arts movement with the figures such as Amiri Baraka, Maya Angelou, Nikki Giovanni, Audre Lorde, Ishmael Reed, Larry Neal, etc., which saw Black American literature moving away from white, especially that white guy literary traditions, with more focus on politically and culturally toward African-based identity and power. So a novel about a biracial woman's quest for her identity with a structure based on Greek mythology, complete with Yiddish wordplay, was far ahead of its time. But during its time, it was not well received. I highly recommend listening to Book or Pop Cultures episode 29 for an insightful and deep discussion on Oreo and its cultural legacy and impact. And I'll put a link in the chat for you all in a bit. But so first of all, with our readers, would someone like to summarize the novel for all of us? Anyone dare?
I can go ahead if you want to.
Oh.
So it follows the main protagonist, Oreo, as she's nicknamed. Half the book really is about her quest to find her father and more about her father's history. But then interestingly, sort of the first half is actually more about setting the sort of her background up and her story up. And that goes through kind of really quickly different aspects of her family history, and kind of challenges that she has and her family have had, but then that leads into setting up why she needs to do this kind of quest later on in the book.
Great. What were everyone, whichever order you want to go in, what were your first impressions? Did you feel like you could easily slip into the book? Or did you have some struggles? What kind of spoke to you initially?
I think for me, certainly the start of the book where you sort of get diagrams and charts, and I wasn't used to that as sort of as a history reader, where you used to sort of constantly, pages upon pages of writing, whereas this sort of broke it down initially to start with, but it also gave it a feel of you trying to understand what her side, as Ben was saying, sort of the build-up of her life before the adventure as she goes on. And I really enjoyed it. It was a new way of reading, but an interesting way of reading.
I found it really interesting, but definitely at the start quite jarring. Um, I had no idea what to expect walking in when I started reading it, and it was far more fragmented in some senses than I anticipated. And the way it lays out the narrative is really interesting, but also because it communicates a lot about people and how Ross viewed a narrative and how it should be viewed, how it impacts people and how people interact in this world of narrative. Um, but it also, in some senses, really, I found it jarring, and I had to kind of get used to it as I read it and learn how to read it well.
Yeah, I think at the beginning I found it quite disorientating as well, especially with all the classical references, and indeed she puts at the end this key for speed readers, non-classicists, etc., which I didn't notice until I finished the book. So it could have helped me earlier actually, but it was all the combinations of various very, very modern cultural references, but also the classical references as well, was something I hadn't encountered in another book. So it was very interesting, but yeah, quite puzzling at first for me.
It is kind of quite methodological in the sense that like the way it's even like everything's subtitled. So if she's talking about, if the author's talking about a certain aspect of Oreo's background or whatever it might be, then you don't kind of you don't kind of have to work out what she's talking about, because it's actually there for you, saying this is a word about such and such. And that's it makes it, in some sense, it makes each individual section easy to read because you know what it's going to be about. But to kind of follow on from one another then becomes a bit sort of jumbled, and you have to make sure that you're not getting lost kind of as you go along, because it's not such an easy thread as it goes through.
Absolutely. It's this combination, like you said, there's math, there's wordplay, there's different registers of cultural language, as well as Yiddish, as well as the Black culture and the Southern accents, and then regular English, and then all these metafiction references to especially Theseus mythology. I was wondering as well, did anyone listen to an audiobook version or even parts of it? And do you think that would have helped if you could listen to it, especially with some of the words that we might not be familiar with, especially come to Yiddish, for example? And how much did you end up Googling words? Or did you just let it flow? Because in the beginning, when I was reading it, I did end up kind of trying to Google, but then I realized once you get into the flow, for me, the context made sense. Wondering whether, because I listened to part of it in audiobook myself, the context was even clearer because of the way it was spoken. So I don't know, did anyone try that, or would you think that could have helped?
I hadn't listened to. No, you go. You go forward.
I was just going to say that I think an audiobook would yeah, definitely help. I didn't use an audiobook, and I didn't Google any words. I found, I know how Luke was saying it was quite fragmented. I enjoyed the way it was fragmented, and as I more and more read into it, I really got into the, as you were saying, the flow of it, and just kept going, and it all came together for me, and I liked the train of thought going through it. Although I think, yeah, an audiobook would definitely help someone. And I may do that next, actually, just to have a read of it, a listen to it.
Yeah, I was going to say a similar point, really, that in some ways you kind of don't need to necessarily know all the different kind of dialects and the words, because you do just kind of read it for what it is. And certainly people reading it in 1974 obviously wouldn't have had access to Google. So it wasn't necessarily, and obviously all of them wouldn't be kind of familiar with Yiddish dialect or whatever it might be. So you kind of wonder, it was written with the knowledge that people wouldn't necessarily understand every word. So I think that's why it kind of does work just as it is, even without that kind of understanding.
Anyone else? Any thoughts?
I had to look up some words at the start. I tried to figure out how much I needed to know it or just let it go. And by the end, I kind of explained it in a similar position as you, where I just stopped and I realized it was actually easier for the flow and actually helped it more to just let it go and realize that like when it actually mattered, she would usually kind of offer a translation or meaning next to it. Sometimes, not always. No, usually not, but sometimes. And then outside of that, you could always figure it out and it was fine. You didn't actually need it necessarily. Yeah.
Yeah, I think built into the book there was this knowledge that the book, you know, Fran Ross knows she's writing a book that was quite esoteric and maybe very few audiences would be able to grasp every single piece of terminology, every single reference in it. And I think that's something, you know, that was embraced rather than it didn't feel like it was the book was broken up in any way with, you know, long explanations of, oh, actually this is what this means. It was only, as Luke said, when it was necessary to explain, I think that there would be explanations, and it felt almost, you know, there's this metafictionality about the book where the writer's voice tends to step in, but also Oreo's voice herself, because even though she is still a fairly young teenager, she does have this knowledge that extends beyond what most people three times her age would seem to know, I think.
Absolutely. How did you feel about the general linguistic inventiveness, the play of words from different cultural code registers, and just the beauty of the parlance? A couple of examples come to my mind, and feel free to share if you mark down anything. For example, on page 27 on our copy, we're reading the Picador 2018 print copy, and she talks about a movie manager's son who was found schwind to death on the day of his 14th birthday. And schwind comes from the Schwinn bicycle company. So he was killed by a bicycle, which I had to look up because I didn't know what schwind was. And I was wondering why it was, because all the Yiddish words tend to be in italics, and that wasn't so, and it was capitalized. So I wondered who or what that was. And I found out it was a 1930s bicycle company. Or then you have on page 175, this passage which I thought was very funny and beautiful is a gentian petal of flame enclosed the saffron pudding of one of 5 Bunsen burners. Above the floor of combustion, a noxious exhalation, an effervescing retort, source of Oreo's nasal irritation. That's quite a funny way of saying something stinks. Any thoughts on and feelings about, or did you have any favorite passages like that that shows the kind of the linguistic inventiveness of Ross?
One of my favorite passages for that was I think it's page 132 is where it starts. Is when Oreo is seeking out her father and stumbles upon this eccentric young actor, Scott, who apparently has a new accent every day, and the one he's speaking in when Oreo arrives is French, but it also incorporates French syntax and phrasing, and it was just so funny and inventive that Oreo quickly adapted to this direct translation of French but speaking English. Like, you know, where, for example, you have reason instead of saying you are right, and she completely picks up on that and adapts to it and speaks to Scott in his own very bizarre register. And the sort of linguistic flexibility and adaptability that there is throughout the book, especially from Oreo herself, was one of my favorite things about reading it.
I think for me, the self-defense system she developed on page 55, the wit way of interstitial thrust, and that sort of plays through the book as well, certainly at a time with Parnell and, you know, in the subway as well. I thought that was a really intelligent and clever thing to develop, and, you know, all the different words that she used there, headlock, shoe kick, and eye pick, you know what they mean, but obviously spelt differently. And yeah, I really enjoyed that part.
I think for me, what I think kind of is most significant for then understanding sort of Oreo's own kind of identity confusion potentially as well is the obviously different dialects then of her two grandparents and her two parents, and then how that kind of plays into then how she's trying to understand her own identity. And obviously, because you have got distinct then different dialects coming from the two sides kind of her heritage, that does sort of then play into and make very clear and obvious the difference in her identity and how she tries to kind of come to terms with that.
Any thoughts, Luke? Is he frozen? No? Right. If Luke manages to get unfrozen, hopefully we'll hear in a minute, but let's move on. What do you think about a statement that this book is not just to be read, but to be experienced?
So I think probably that is a fair description, in the sense that you really get every aspect of who she is, who Oreo is, rather than just if it was just purely this quest based on the mythology of her finding her father, that would be just kind of a narrative. But because you've got all the other elements of her growing up and her family, and even so far back as kind of her parents coming together and all the issues with her family there, that really makes you experience her quest with her, rather than just sort of following it as it goes along.
Yeah, you go back to the introduction that Ben was saying earlier, that the first half of the book really sort of draws you into her life and Oreo's way of thinking, and how she perceives life and what she wants to do with it. And as Mia said, for someone who's so young to have the knowledge that she has and the confidence that you see all the way through the book, to travel to sort of New York at the age of 14 is quite a an amazing thing to do. And you experience every sort of aspect. I think as if you stick with it from the start to the end, then you do experience the book, and it's a very interesting experience that you go through. And certainly as an older person like myself, you actually see some of the things, and you've experienced some of them yourself as you get older. Didn't experience as much when I was 14, but certainly as you get older through life, some of the things that she's gone through you can relate to quite closely, which only adds to the experience of the book.
Yeah, I think the experience, as opposed to simply reading, was partly helped by the pace as well. It's just so fast moving, and it feels like that not just structurally, but because Oreo is genuinely just doing so much in so little time. And it felt almost like I was trying to keep up with her for some of the book, because there's just bizarre and fantastic events, and just pages apart, and it in that way it felt almost kind of cinematic, and that did build this sense of experience rather than just reading what's on the page.
Absolutely. Hi, Luke. Welcome back. Can you hear us?
Sorry.
That's absolutely
Yeah,
fine.
my Wi-Fi just totally went out.
Technology is what it is. We were just I was just asking a question from everyone. If you want to give your thoughts, what do you think about the statement that this is a book not just to be read, but to be experienced?
I mean, it's certainly an experience reading it. It's just very different. It requires so much more work to read than novels where we've learned the form, that I think you actually have to you have to engage it in a way that's really kind of conscious and trying to actually kind of decipher it. It's almost like a puzzle as you're reading it. I remember when I was reading it, trying to piece together how each part of it fit into the myth of Theseus, and then also working out how Fran Ross wanted the narrative to actually relate to things, if there was intelligibility or if it was kind of ironic. If it is ironic, but if it's actually somehow, I guess not, but it also is, and which side they land on, and she just doesn't land on many sides. She kind of just resists landing. And then the novel is constantly in motion, and so you're constantly actively trying to grab pieces and make sense of it as you go.
Absolutely. And that reminds me, if you had to, would you be able to put this book in any specific genre or a mix of genres?
I
mean, it reminds me.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, you go for it. You go for it.
Oh, okay, thank you. I'd be tempted to put it into picaresque first, and then maybe satire as well. But the focus of the satire is so varied, whereas in a lot of the other satires I tend to read, that are kind of solidly categorized as such, have a very clear focus. Whereas this one, there are so many different things that are satirized so quickly. It's sometimes you blink and you miss it, sort of thing. But the picaresque aspect, I really felt the young person going on this, very varied and chaotic adventure, really. I feel like that's the genre I'd be most drawn to.
You were going to say something, like?
Yes. I don't know if I have like a position of a genre in my mind, because all the books it reminds me of are very hard to place too. It reminded me in some senses of Infinite Jest, and just David Foster Wallace's writings, he's obviously much later, but it's similar in the fragmentation, as in the fragmentation is so prevalent, and yet the fragmentation lends itself to trying to make sense of meaning. Like it's almost trying to make sense of things through fragmentation. And so I don't know if it's a movie. I mean, obviously Foster Wallace is both postmodern and metamodern, in some senses, which is more just now kind of entering the pop culture. But it's not metamodern, which is more meta, to explain. Metamodernism does the move of postmodernism, but then tries to land towards some sense of groundedness. So it critiques even as it asserts, which is what, like, everything everywhere all at once, and like those kind of movies. What else? Like the new Spider-Man, like weird multiverse movies. They're all doing that. And I don't know if it's a genre, because it's so weird, and it's so disorienting, but I think it is in that movement, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. Any of our historians have thoughts? I know it's a heavily literary question, I get that, but one of my next questions anyway is, and this is for everyone again, how do you think, if it did, do your backgrounds play into the reading and comprehending of the novel? So being from the UK versus US, being male versus female, being literary versus history students.
I think in terms of sort of genre, obviously I can't sort of give the specific knowledge that literary students would be able to. But one aspect I'm interested in is kind of how it fits into being a sort of race novel, because that and in some ways it could be framed as that, but I think it's kind of more sort of about human nature rather than about racial identity and racial politics or anything like that. And I think that's interesting, especially from the year that it was published. It does say in the edition that we have, when it gives information about Fran Ross, and it talks about it being published in the height of the Black Power movement. But I'm not sure necessarily how relevant that is to the book, because I think in some ways it kind of undermines the Black Power movement, because the Black Power movement was very much sort of about the kind of African American identity, whereas this obviously isn't. It's more about how does how does that work if someone is of multiple identities, and where do they fit into that, and actually how would Oreo fit into the Black Power movement versus the sort of the early 60s civil rights movement, because that's a very kind of a different approach to identity and specific individual identities that are very important to who you are, and how you fit into America. But for someone like Oreo, then who's got the Jewish identity and the Black identity, where does that work for her? And so I think it's difficult to be categorized as a race novel, even though somebody might, just from looking at it and what it's about, they might think that initially, but I think it's much more sort of about human nature in general.
Yeah, I certainly agree with Ben there. Yeah, when you initially look at it, you think, yeah, this is going to be a race novel, but I found it very much, certainly with Oreo, the main protagonist being a female, very empowering for her. And I think to me, that was the way the book was going. And there was more, I got more about, her being such a strong individual rather than the race side. And that's what I took from the book more, which may be why it didn't hit the heights in 74 when obviously the Black Power movement was around. Yeah, maybe that was why it didn't hit the heights it could have done. And now it's certainly one that people should be looking at.
Yeah, I think when I was reading it, I mean, one of the parts of, I guess, my very brief academic background so far is I've done some work on coming of age literature, and the idea of seeing Oreo through that lens was, I mean, it was, at first it seemed natural, but the more I got through the novel, the more it didn't seem to fit into that at all. Even though it starts off with the whole setting up that the book is going to be about her finding the secret of her birth, that's very much distinct from her finding the secret of who she is, because that seems to be completely fully formed before the first page. She seems like a complete human being, and I think part of that is about resisting, that the readers might want to try and project conflict onto her identity because of having a Jewish background and a Black background, but also because she's, in a single parent family, and because she's got a very distant relationship with her father. But because as Ross creates this character who seems so competent and sure of herself, and also in a quite realistic way, I think Oreo knows exactly what she's capable of and exactly what she isn't capable of. I think that resists this reading that I was originally inclined to do, both from a genre standpoint of what I thought was going to be a Bildungsroman, and also from a social and political standpoint, because it's not about Oreo finding herself. It's about her just meeting her father for a brief few minutes at the end of the book and going on this adventure before that.
Yeah, that's really interesting what Mia said, that it would have been very easy for Fran Ross to make it about sort of a lost character that yearns for finding her father to complete her identity or complete her life, when in actual fact it's more that she goes on this journey because she's already kind of a complete person that's sure of herself and confident, rather than because she's lost and needs that in her life. That then, I suppose, runs through the novel, which allows all the other things to come in the humor and the satire, because it's not just about this kind of poor lost young girl that needs to find her father. It's more about a confident, I guess, more mature for her age than most other young people would be, but then she hasn't been affected by her father not being there. Instead, it's that she just wants it for her own interest and her own kind of part of why she's like kind of an explorer and an adventurer, rather than her being kind of lost with that.
it's interesting what both of y'all just said, because so in 1977 there was a novel published, like, again just a few years after Oreo was, called Ceremony by Leslie Marmon Silko, and it also follows a man who is half Native American. He's I can't remember the tribe, but and half white. And it cheapens it to say post-colonial, but it's kind of a post-colonial, postmodern novel, and it's amazing. But it's interesting reading them side by side because they both cover this kind of instance of uncertain identity. But they take very different frames, where in Oreo, it's kind of a total disconnection from, in some senses, like there's no, like, Oreo doesn't change much to the novel. She doesn't like there's no like instance where I can point to and be like, this is where like her arc came to a climax and now there's a fundamental shift in who she is. She's so, like you were saying, she's such an individual. She asserts herself so confidently that she kind of is able to overcome all of these things with very little, at least very little nod to an emotional shift or an inner change that happens. Whereas in this other novel, Ceremony, which is kind of not fair to talk about because y'all haven't read it probably, but it takes a very different turn, where actually the entire novel is this main character striving to be connected with the past, this old Native American religious culture, religious, but also like just general like worldview that's being lost with the expansion of America westward. And I kind of wonder if Oreo is interested, even though it has the whole Theseus myth it's playing with. But I'm actually curious to hear y'all's thoughts on if you think Oreo is trying to connect itself to a past and then using that as a future driver, or if Oreo as a character in the novel as a whole is simply trying to show an assertion of identity and kind of like more in that sense critique a culture than a person. Does that make any sense? Maybe it's too vague.
It makes sense to me. To add to that, while you think about your thoughts on that, in the introduction, in our copy, Marlon James said that you cannot date Oreo because Oreo flouts date. So I think that kind of also fits into that thought of, because we talked a lot about that this came out in 1974 when there were a lot of days, like Luke just mentioned, a lot of books came out that explore identities and cultural identities, especially being in a hotspot that is America and American culture as well, because most people will be backgrounds from Europe or Native or Africa or whatever. There's only Native Americans can claim to be purely American, I guess. And it kind of plays into this kind of sense of identity. So yeah, that was a great question, Luke. Any thoughts, anyone?
I think in terms of whether it's kind of a critique of the character of Oreo or a critique of kind of the culture that she's living within, I think I would argue that it is more of a critique of the kind of American cultural landscape in terms of things like identity, because again, it would have been really easy to have a sort of a white heritage on the one side and a black heritage on the other side, and then you've got the kind of the racist white grandparents who are disapproving of the interracial relationship. But I think because you've got this Jewish heritage on the one side and the black heritage on the other, and both of those, you've got grandparents on both sides that are disapproving to such an extent that it causes either kind of death or paralysis, or then that kind of, it kind of highlights how complicated American identity is. And I think obviously the nickname itself comes from a different reason, but clearly the Oreo, the use of Oreo is there for a specific reason, and I think it does kind of critique in that sense that what is, if you're not sort of Black American or you're not Jewish American, then how do you become you can be Black American and you can be Jewish American and American, but if you don't fit into either of those neat identity descriptions, then are you American, and what kind of American are you? So in inverted commas, who are you? How are you American? Because you can't claim purely to be part of that one cultural group or that one ethnic group or religious group. So instead, you're this kind of complicated figure where you've got family issues with them not approving, and you've got no kind of set identity of you are in this sense an American, because actually it's too complicated to fit into any of those groups.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, my immediate response, my gut response is very American to me, to be like, to more assert that it's not American by, but if you like to give a very like not political, but like public facing, like broad view of Americans, because America is I mean, all these things, but like all the classic like presidential slogans. But but I think it's interesting how what you just said. Sorry, my dog's in the way. But Oreo, like I guess what I'm wondering is, does Oreo like assert an idea, or does it actually stabilize the narrative enough to say what it's actually trying to say, or does it kind of subvert everything we think it's saying, as after we think it'll present one thing, evidence of one thing it's saying, and then subvert the next sentence, like. And so how do we read Oreo with, like, should we read Oreo trying to see what like a stable Fran Ross is, or is our goal rather to purposefully to be unstable? Is this, like, in some sense, is the stability actually stable, or is the stability in its instability as a novel, both formally in the narrative, but then also just how it views identity, how it views it's almost, I think the introduction said post identity, or somewhere in the book. Is it trying to assert, like, I'm really wrestling with how it views identity, because I'm not convinced. Like, do we think Fran Ross knows what to do with identity at this point? Because she's so ahead of her time. Is she embracing it, or is she saying we should get rid of these typings that she's subverting as she goes? Or is she embracing them? She's kind of doing both. And I'm not sure what to do with that entirely.
There's in relation to that, Dr. True Leverett said, and I'll read the quote out loud. Oreo by no means suggests that the dualities of identity make it possible for one to escape the realities and constraints of racism, sexism, and oppression. Rather, the novel suggests that dualities allow one to play both literally and figuratively with the structures of identity, allow one to manipulate boundaries and seek agency in the arenas where these structures might seem rigid and inaccessible. So that kind of talks about what you were saying there, I think. Any thoughts, anyone else as well?
Yeah.
No? Are we getting too philosophical here? Right, I do have a next question then, and we'll let that sink in for a while then. What does the novel tell us about being a woman? Do you think this is a feminist novel? If you think of, for example, Helen, Oreo's mother, on page 54, there's this beautiful quote where she's speaking, and she says, "This is a subject I've given a lot of thought to, and I think I have the answer. I've tried to encompass my theory all the sociological, mythological, religious, philosophical, muscular, economic, cultural, musical, physical, ethical, intellectual, metaphysical, anthropological, gynecological, historical, hormonal, environmental, judicial, legal, moral, ethnic, governmental, linguistic, psychological, schizophrenic, glottal, racial, poetic, dental, this was the logical link. Artistic, military, and urinary considerations from prehistoric times to the present. I have been able to synthesize these considerations into one inescapable formulation. Men can knock the shit out of women. Any thoughts?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind when you said that is the fact that Oreo herself did triumph over the sort of intimidation of Parnell towards the end, and both physically and intellectually triumphed in that situation. But that doesn't deny the danger that she was in, not just as a woman, but as a woman going around on her own in a city that she's not familiar with, or as a girl, even because she's 14. But I think the novel does definitely depict the sort of the danger and the threat of being female alone and in public, but it also there's an element where it definitely veers away from realistic portrayals, because I was never in doubt that Oreo would find a solution and find a way to escape unscathed from any situation. So I still don't quite know how to take that, because I understand the novel isn't setting itself up to be realistic, and there's so many wonderful, absurd and implausible elements to it, and I think that could be read as maybe just a very distinct but still feminist approach of celebrating Oreo's independence and ability and resourcefulness in situations. But I still can't completely grasp whether what my feelings on that are.
I wonder if it fits more into today's feminism, as in the quotation that you read out, into today's version of feminism and the narratives within it, rather than when it was actually published, because there is more of an emphasis now on sort of the danger that females have on their own, and kind of there's all sorts of charities that are there that kind of helplines that you can call at night, that kind of thing, and that all now fits within today's feminism, which is potentially more of a realistic understanding of those dangers and what it means to support women, so to speak. Whereas perhaps in the 1970s, when Fran Ross actually wrote that quotation, that there was more of an emphasis on kind of promoting the idea of like the strength of women and the physical equality of men and women, and potentially denying that aspect that actually, when it comes down to it, then, like the quotation states, that men can knock the shit out of women, and that kind of really hits home to a fundamental kind of danger and issue and challenge to women that perhaps other feminists in the 1970s weren't kind of talking about in the way that feminists talk about now. So I think maybe it fits better into today's feminism than it does into the feminism of the 1970s. I'd be interested to see what other people think about that.
Yeah, I think I'm in agreement there, Ben. Obviously, I would say that when this was written, there was a lot more things going on behind closed doors, whereas nowadays things are becoming more open. And but I also, the quote from page 54 leads us on to Oreo developing her own self-defense system again, but I think at the time Ross wasn't striving for realism, and because I don't think that would be real at the time, as Mia was saying. But now, as time has passed, you can see how it fits more and more as the years go on into sort of today's thinking. Yeah, definitely.
And there was a big difference in the 70s, because this was sort of the second wave of feminism that was coming out in the 60s, 70s, which was still very much considered white women's feminism. The intersections of race were not in play as such. So a lot of Black writers at the time, they were struggling to identify themselves in that movement because it was so much led by white women. And I think that passage kind of shows that as well, because as a white woman, I wouldn't be afraid. And Helen talks about this in the book, that that's the dentist bit, is how she's, there's a fear. What if the dentist happens to be a racist and has a hatred towards people of color, and then pushes in that drill just a little bit harder? Now, I can't say that I've ever thought that I would have to fear something like that when I go. I don't like dentists in general, but I don't have to fear that they're going to deliberately cause me excess pain. And I think that passage shows not just feminist movement in general, and but Helen trying to make sense of it from those intersections of being female, being of color, being yada, 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 So it kind of all plays into that. Any other thoughts from the rest of you?
I also kind of wonder if there's some interplay with the way everyone in that era would have viewed childhood generally, and how not like it's not whatever happens, but it also can sometimes in America, especially, I don't know about Britain, but in America it kind of was the kids would go out and they would do whatever they wanted, and they'd get in trouble and trouble would find them, and it was kind of like a shrug, like for good or ill, like that is just how my parents were raised, and so I think there's a lot of, I kind of wonder how that interplays with Ross's kind of givenness of like, oh yeah, she's 14, she just left, went on this journey to New York, and just did all of these things, and so there's that side where I kind of think that part of it, I'm like, oh, actually, I can believe that happening, like that actually is not that unrealistic for me, weirdly, but then you start realizing again, it's just like Tony was saying, the realism aspect, it's just not like, there's just so much of the novel, not just including Oreo's own capabilities in combat, but also just the general interactions, like the way it's laid out does not feel realistic, not to its detriment at all, because it's not trying to be. And so I don't know entirely what it says about Ross's view of women as such. I really have no idea, but I do think it's interesting how she views. I don't know. I'm trying to figure out how she views the interplay between the unrealistic aspect of it and also the kind of self-critical aspect. It's almost self-reflexively, it knows it's not. It's so sarcastic. It uses sarcasm to get around being cliche or being so unrealistic it's not funny or not believable. It's believable because it's self-reflexive and because it's ironic. I don't know what that says about her view of women as such, because that actually kind of just more complicates it than answers the question. Sorry, I wish I could give more clarity, but I don't have it internally.
I do have another quote I wanted to read and get, because it kind of plays into this discussion as well, as from 160. I'll start a little bit before. The women shifted impatiently in their chairs, every once in a while casting at Oreo what she took to be Aristotle's glances of pity and fear leavened by Desade's anticipation of unmentionable acts. As agreed upon by both parties, Oreo with a nod, Kirk with 2 floor pawings, Parnell snapped his fingers 3 times as the signal to begin. Oreo stood quietly where she was, in the center of the mat. Kirk came out of his corner with his nose wide open. As he advanced, his stallion did an impressive caracole right, no slouch caracole left, then majestically reared its head. He threw the unresisting Oreo to the floor, stretched her legs wide in the ready set position of a nutcracker, took aim, tried to jam his pole into her vault, and much to his and everyone else's surprise, met with a barrier that propelled him backward and sent him bounding off the nearest wall. So not only is this passage, in my opinion, quite funny, it shows all those kind of metafiction layers where Kirk kind of takes this minotaur figure where taking the sacrifice of the young maiden as it is in the Theseus's exploration of the labyrinth of the Minotaurs. That also shows kind of this funny element of being propelled backwards. Shows the strength, like Mia was talking about, the strength of Oreo as well. So any further thoughts on that passage or how that plays in any perspective, not just feminist or whatever, because I think that just combines all these various elements. That is the beauty of Ross's writing. There's philosophy, there's literature, there's mythology, there's strength of a woman, there's all of these elements that I found in that one passage alone kind of is summarized almost.
I think from one point of view, obviously, as a reader, you're kind of celebrating like Oreo is well done, Oreo, kind of that kind of viewpoint. But then I don't know how necessarily helpful each time Oreo does do something that's potentially unrealistic in terms of her capabilities, how kind of helpful that actually is to like understanding reality and the reality of situations for a 14-year-old black girl that's gone to New York, kind of. So obviously it's great as a read, and you want to support, as you read any work of fiction, you want to support the main protagonist usually, and that's kind of the point, and you want to follow their journey with them. So that's great as you're reading it, but I'm not sure how helpful it is in terms of actually understanding reality.
Anyone else thoughts?
Yeah, I think I think I agree with him. It's when you read books that are coming out in a similar-ish era, like I mentioned before, Ceremony or Toni Morrison's Beloved, these or Invisible Man, which is a little bit before. You have, I think, you have experiences portrayed that are particular, and yet also open up wider, because to a broader audience, to actually a universal human appeal, because they actually root themselves and their narratives in something that is experientially true. So they have these extreme circumstances. I mean, in Beloved, it's the narrative of a woman who murders her child to keep him from being enslaved. And so it's obviously extreme, but also there's a realism to the entire novel that is haunting. And I kind of don't think Oreo does that at all. It's very different from the moves a lot of the novels dealing with similar topics in the similar era made. It's much less connected to a literary tradition, and it's very ahead of its time. It's kind of trying to do its own thing, which is what Oreo in the novel is doing too. But I kind of think at times that can, like, it can make it more difficult for people who don't understand the context of the novel of Fran Ross to enter in fully. I think it can be an obstacle for engagement somewhat. And I think that passage, I found it really challenging, both because it's hard, like reading it. I mean, I was quite morally kind of perturbed by so much of it. But I think it was obviously written very ironically with a lot of comedy in mind. And I kind of wonder if at points Ross can go so far into irony that she unintentionally or intentionally, I'm not sure which, undermines the ability for the reader to actually emotively connect with anything that's actually happening in the novel, because it's so unrealistic, it's so heightened without any emotional grounding or other sense of grounding, that it's sometimes hard to get a grasp on events and to know what she's trying to do with them.
Anyone else thoughts?
I agree with that that comment about sort of the emotional detachment that can ensue from this hyper ironic writing and content. But there was also something I found really I don't know, really effective about that it was incredible for me to read a book that did very obviously touch on issues of violence against women, in which there was no extended passages that were incredibly emotional or just sort of that indulge this image of vulnerable, suffering women, which I think is what most people come to expect, including myself, in any of these situations. And that's not to say that's a bad thing, because that's based on reality. Those things happen. But I don't think I'd encountered a book or any piece of media that looked at a character going through these scenarios that were profoundly dangerous and disturbing, in which there was no there was nothing overly emotive, and that there's this in which I felt like just confidence in the main character to come out absolutely fine with you know, emotionally and physically, and that was a strange but interesting reading experience. And I think it felt important to me by virtue of it being, you know, a rare feature of books that I've read, that Oreo did was herself threatened by Parnell, by Kirk, and there was also that guy on the subway as well that I think tried to steal her bag, if I remember rightly, and yet there was there was no reduction of her character into a victim or into just poor suffering young girl.
Absolutely agree with that. And you can see that also in this quest for her father, like you mentioned earlier as well, I believe. And then the father dies, and there's not this big emotional scene with it. But you would have expected that would be the culmination of the novel, because that was her quest. But it kind of doesn't do that. It doesn't give you that expected ending or reaction. And that impacted my reading experiences as well, because it questioned my own reactions before I even had them. That leads me to the next question. I'm conscious of time as well, but I am curious, does any of you have a passage that you would like to share and discuss, what that spoke to you or made you question what you were reading? Any passage at all from the book that any of you feel strongly about one way or another?
I think for me, which kind of relates to what I was talking about earlier, it's the letters from Oreo's mother, because I think they kind of, it's one of the best examples of how Fran Ross throughout the book sort of uses these odd kind of combinations of random different things to present who Oreo is and who her character is. And I think it's a really kind of effective way of showing that, like, their kind of complicated relationship. And I just think it's a good example of all the different random things that Fran Ross does, but one of the most effective ones in helping to portray the character of Oreo.
Anyone else?
I mean, I was gonna actually kind of comment on something that Ben was saying. I thought the letters were really interesting because they were the closest, reading them and reading in those chapters right around the letters were the closest I came in the novel to really being let into an emotive connection, or any sense of, like, not emotive because it's not like sentimental, more just like empathetic. Whereas
And
I actually
personal.
understood yeah, like you read deeper in. I think it's one of the deepest looks you have into any of the characters in the novel, because it's not the immediate lens, but it's the one thing she's choosing. It's the only thing she's choosing to write, right? So you're seeing these bits and pieces of an actual consciousness. That's, I think, weirdly, it's not, the novel is so close to Oreo's mind, but also the narrator's kind of bleeding in. But the letters were a rare point where there wasn't the kind of interference between the narrator and the character speaking, where you actually just get a character's words, in the letters at least. And I found that really interesting. I thought that was where I actually started kind of leaning in a little more about the novel.
Funny, Mia, any thoughts or any passages you like to share?
I think the passage that's coming to mind, and that is definitely one of my favorites, was just that of the first page, that fantastic symmetry which Fran Ross reveals the reactions of Oreo's grandparents on both maternal and paternal sides of Christine and not Christine, Helen. Was it? Yeah, it is Helen. I'm getting confused with character names. Helen and James's marriage, and these two very dramatic events of someone dying instantly and then someone instantly becoming paralyzed are so sort of so bluntly and briefly revealed with plenty of exclamation marks and play on words. It's I found that a really striking introduction to the book, and the way both of the reactions of the grandparents mirror each other and have virtually the same structure is it really pokes fun at the and I suppose gives the reader a chance to laugh at people's the extent of people's prejudices, because their prejudices end up harming them more than they end up, being, well, I can't see any way that they benefit them, but the prejudices that the grandparents hold end up killing one and paralyzing the other. And the other characters seem to have, flourished regardless of those prejudices.
I think for me, it's sort of probably on the last page where she's talking about meeting her paternal grandfather, and she basically just says, and it sort of sums it up, that if he showed love and affection to her, she'd give the vials as a present. If not, there was no skin off her skin. So it's sort of like she's done this massive journey, but isn't actually bothered at the end, and that's what really hit me when I get, like you say, you've attached yourself to her, and you think this is going to be she's going to be so upset with her father dying, but it's not about that. It's about her journey and what she's done along the way that draws you in. And after sort of the end, you sort of think, well, actually, it didn't really matter if she met her father or not, because everything else is the important bit and what you see through the book. That was for me anyway. Maybe I got it wrong, but that's how I got it.
No, and that passage kind of speaks to the motto she took on for herself, doesn't it? What was it? It's Nemo me impune lacessit. No one attacks me with impunity. Yeah. So it kind of speaks to that, doesn't it? That very ending of it as well.
Definitely.
I have one final question. Obviously, if yourselves have any questions or thoughts, feel free. But I have one final question. If you were to teach or have this book taught to you, what would you imagine you would need? How would you bring this book into a tutorial or into a learning setting? What would you need? What do you want to know? How would you go about approaching a text like this in history as well as literary studies? Because it does combine a lot of those in one short book. It's a very short book, considerably. And you can see all these different sides and all these periods and all this literary and the historical and the metafiction and all of those different layers. So I'm just curious, as undergraduate students at the moment, how would you like this to be brought to you?
I think something that would be particularly important to me if I were learning this would be looking at theories of comedy and humor and laughter, and how those intersect with political and social messages, and various opinions on what sort of laughter warrants what sort of reaction, and how it can or can't be used as a force for change and changing people's perspectives as well as material social change. So I think that would have, to me, that seems like something that would be important in a tutorial on Oreo.
Maybe
Yeah,
these
go
trials
for it.
that would help certainly a history student. Go away, read that first, and then come back to the book on Oreo, and then maybe try and see the connection. I mean, you do immediately once you get to it, but yeah, I think from a history side that would be interesting.
Mhm. Yeah, I think similar to what Tony was saying, but slightly different. Looking at and making sure you actually understand, and the students understand, I understand the historical context, both generally, like what kind of development, ideologically, historically, philosophically, theologically, has happened around the writing of this novel. Then also how this text both is operating in conjunction with, in conversation with, and in difference with novels in its similar era and those before. I mean, obviously, Theseus is pretty paramount and important throughout the whole novel. But also even just, again, like I mentioned before, the way it differs so foundationally from many other novels dealing with similar subjects at the same time, or around the same time period, same literary movement. I think that to me helped, it informed a lot of what she was trying to do, knowing who she was responding to, who she was writing around. And so I think any tutorial that I would be a part of, I would love it if the tutor were to actually give us enough context to historically ground the text in a way that we could actually work with tangibly.
Yeah, I think for me, it would definitely be most effective contextualized within kind of arguments and narratives around identity. And I think that really is kind of fundamental to the book itself and everything within it, even though there's so many other layers. But I think so much of it, especially because of the different dialects used as well. And then, like Mia highlighted, the very start of the book, how it straight away displays the prejudices that were there. I think you've got to have an understanding of identity in America in the 1970s, but also more historically as well, and kind of how that then links to different social movements, political movements. And in a way, it doesn't really link to any of them because so many of them are very keen to always pigeonhole different groups into different ways that they should act or that they should different viewpoints they should have. Whereas for a mixed race, Black, Jewish girl like Oreo was, or is portrayed to be, it really sort of complicates the idea of American identity. And I think that so an understanding of identity is fundamental to understanding what's kind of important within the novel itself.
And I found that interesting that none of you kind of mentioned the language itself. So obviously the complicated wordplay and the different register, the different codes, cultural and otherwise, that come into play is not the key factor in it. I think a lot of people, when they first pick it up, might be intimidated by the way it's written. But like we said in the beginning already, that kind of, if you get into the flow of it, it plays itself out. And I thought that was the contextualization you all kind of find a lot more important than how it's written or the language used, which is very interesting for me as a linguist and a literary studies person. That I find that very, very interesting, that contextualization matters more than the way it's written. And I find that very interesting. I am conscious of the time, so I'm gonna stop us here. Thank you everyone so much for joining in. I hope you really, really enjoyed the book and not just go through the movements. But thank you so much. I'll make this available in YouTube and I will email you all shortly. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Super. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Have a nice day.
You too all.
Nice to meet you all. Bye.
Cheers.
Nice to meet you.